My wife is an actress, and some years ago she wanted to audition for a part in a play with a certain production company. But there was a problem. Even though they'd worked together before and loved each other, the producers felt she wasn't right for the new play. Now, my wife knew that she could play the part well, and her first reaction was to write a very sharp letter. "I was so surprised and disappointed. I think you're making a real mistake. I know I can play this part well." But we realized it wasn't going to change their minds. So we rewrote the letter. Within 24 hours after sending it, my wife got word that the producers wanted to see her. And when they saw her for the audition, they told her, "You know, we really didn't think it made sense to have you in for this audition, but we changed our minds when we got your letter." That experience illustrates the thing that we'll be focusing on in this session: persuasion tools, simple, powerful ideas and approaches that can help you get past no and turn a negotiation impasse into a more constructive discussion. That is, things that can help you turn a difficult counterpart to an agreeable and committed one. As we'll see, many of these tools draw on an understanding of interests and options. Others rely on proven influencing principles and time-honored ways to win a real hearing. None require flim-flam, dishonesty, or subterfuge. Quite the opposite. Each has the ability to be gentle on the person, hard on the problem. So how did my wife change her producers' minds? She relied on two magic words: "You're right." One of the best ways to win credibility, attention, and consideration for your ideas is to show up front that you genuinely agree with something the other person says or thinks, that you find it to be true, valid, justifiable. Truthfully saying "you're right" is powerful because it demonstrates that you respect the other person, see her reasonableness, affirm her concerns, and demonstrate that you're not going to ride roughshod needlessly over them. It also lets you connect her belief to your point. Here essentially is what my wife wrote. "Hey, Judy and Bob, I understand you didn't want to audition me because you didn't feel I was right for the part of Karen in Dinner with Friends. I understand you need someone who can play the qualities of X, Y, and Z. You're right. If I was the casting director and I thought an actress couldn't play X, Y, and Z, I wouldn't cast her as Karen either. It might interest you to know that I recently finished a very successful run of A Little Night Music at another excellent regional theater, playing the role of Charlotte, a part that emphasizes X, Y, and Z. Since I might have just what you're looking for, I wonder if an audition might make sense for us." The challenge is to put aside our natural temptation to disagree, disprove, rebut, in short, to argue with the other person. Instead, the idea is to intentionally listen carefully to anything she says or cares about that you can truly affirm. You can then build on what she already believes to make your point. That takes discipline. I know. I'm an attorney, and I spent 3 years training to counter the other guy's argument. I have to put that impulse aside and look for places where the other person is being reasonable. So, for example, imagine that the other person says, "We can't go to the reunion because that's the day Grandpa has his bingo event." You might say, "You're right. Grandpa's routines and his happiness are very important. I noticed that he's gladly missed bingo 3 of the last 10 weeks for local family events he's attended, and he's often said he loves a reunion, but he can be fussy. So I wonder if we can find a way to invite him that he'll gladly accept." Saying you're right doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything or even most of what the other person says. It doesn't mean that you automatically foreclose your own argument or simply suck up to the other person. It's quite the opposite, really. What you're simply doing is looking for grounds on which you can build an argument, showing that at least to some degree you're in sync with the other person's thinking. So it's much easier and less threatening for the other person to hear you out and consider your ideas. "You're right" is closely related to a second persuasion tool that allows me to share one of my favorite stories, the story of someone you've probably never heard of before, a man named Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the son of the famous president. He went by the name Ted. In 1944, Ted Roosevelt was a brigadier general serving as an army general for the American Army in World War II. By all accounts, Ted Roosevelt was a heroic and capable leader of men who was very cool under fire. Unfortunately, he was a friend of someone who was persona non grata with senior officers who held Ted guilty by association. So by 1944, Ted was sidelined, basically given a desk job. Now, Ted Roosevelt knew that the military was planning the D-Day invasion, and he wanted very much to be in the thick of it. In fact, he wanted to be in the front lines. So he went to his commanding officer, Tubby Barton, and said, I want to be in one of the first landing craft to land on Utah Beach. Not surprisingly, Barton turned him down cold, and you can see all sorts of reasons why he did. First of all, for goodness sake, Roosevelt, you're walking around with a cane. You were injured in combat, that's laudable, but this is no place to be walking around wounded. Second, have you noticed? You're persona non grata. Third, you're the son of a president. If you get killed, how do you think I'm going to look? Fourth, let's face it, this is basically a suicide run. Most of the men in that first landing craft wave are not coming back. Fifth, there's no general in any theater of combat anywhere in World War II who's in the front lines, for goodness sake, so your request is ridiculous. Don't even think about it. Roosevelt came back a few weeks later and asked again, but again, Barton turned him down. But then Ted Roosevelt wrote a letter to Barton. In response to it, Barton summoned Roosevelt and said this, Roosevelt, everything within me still argues against agreeing with your request, but I can't refuse a letter like this, so I'm going to grant it, and God be with you. And sure enough, Ted Roosevelt really did land in one of the first landing craft on Utah Beach on D-Day, and it turned out Barton had made a brilliant choice, because Ted Roosevelt so proved himself there that he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest military honor for service in the U.S. military. How did Ted Roosevelt change Barton's mind? In essence, Ted used a persuasion technique we can call help me serve your interests. That is, show how your request helps you meet the other's needs. So what was in Ted Roosevelt's letter? In essence, this is what it said. The invasion depends on the performance of the first soldiers who land. They are inexperienced. If they stumble under heavy gunfire, then their fear and failure will communicate itself inevitably to all the next waves of landing soldiers, and the whole invasion will be in jeopardy. But I can steady them. If they know that I'm there, they will be able to act under fire. That confidence and success will communicate itself to the next wave and the next and the next, and the invasion will have a much better chance of success. Also, I can be there to give you a clear sense of what's actually going on when you land, which you'll need to further prosecute the invasion. And lastly, they know who I am. They're familiar with me. They're comfortable with me. They have confidence in me. So I really can steady their nerves. In short, you need the first wave of troops to be steady in the invasion, if the invasion is going to succeed. So give me a frontline command to help me steady them for you. Help me serve your interest is powerful because it speaks directly to the listener's felt needs. It connects your request to his goals. It's particularly effective when you're working with people who oversee you. But there's a related method that can work in any situation. To introduce this next persuasion tool, I want to share with you something that happened to a student of mine named Greg. Greg wanted to be a guest on a televised radio call-in show hosted by famed shock jock Howard Stern. He called Howard's show one morning after waking up and said he wanted to make sound effects for Howard. The call screener said, "All right, let's hear you do one." So Greg did his impression of a chainsaw. "I've heard it. It's great." The screener said, "Wow, that was great. Hold for Howard." Now, remember, Greg wanted to actually get on the show live, on camera. So when Howard came on, Greg did his routine, and Howard liked it, and he said, "Let me hear some more." And after a while, Howard said, "Okay, thank you very much." Then Greg said, "Howard, How about if I come into the studio and do even more for you? Howard wasn't particularly interested. He said, frankly, we've got the basic idea over the phone. Then Greg said this, Howard, I'm down the street and you wouldn't want to disappoint your fans. I know you need guests on the show today. I'm ready and able, and I can be there in 20 minutes. Howard said, are you going to do the same sounds or are you going to do different ones? And Greg said, oh, I can do different ones that are even better. Look, Howard, your show is the best and so are you. Just put me on for 5 minutes. And Howard Stern said, okay, come on down. Within half an hour of waking up that morning, Greg was on national television, and he did a great job, so great that they gave him a second gig on another TV show. I've seen it. It was really good. How did Greg do that? How did he manage to pull that off? He used a persuasion tool called If We Agree, If We Disagree. If we agree, if we disagree works like this. You first state why your proposal is good from the other person's perspective, what specific interests it serves. Then you show why saying no would actually hurt the other person's interests and might actually create concerns or problems for him. You do that tactfully, but you make that clear. The reason this approach is powerful is twofold. First, it builds on an idea that skilled negotiators know well. Doubts drive deals. Often, one of the reasons we say yes is because we're worried about what will happen if we don't say yes, if we're left without any agreement at all. When you say, if we disagree, you bring forth the power of that point. There are real worries you may not have considered. Let me tactfully bring them to your attention. At the same time, you're saying, if we agree, this is good for you. Don't worry about my needs right now. Let me show you why this serves your needs. You can walk through them one by one. That's exactly what Greg intentionally did. No kidding, Greg jotted these points down in a couple of minutes as he waited for Howard to pick up the phone. Not bad. Oh, and by the way, how did Greg know that Howard had no guests that day? He actually asked the screener. Nice research, Greg. Beyond ideas that build on the power of interests, what other persuasion methods are there? Let me tell you a story. Several years ago, I was teaching a 4-day negotiation course in a city in France. I taught there annually for years, but for some reason that year, the students were talking so much in class that I could barely hear myself. Students were coming and going with impunity. Some were surfing the web. 2 women were reading a magazine. And it turns out I wasn't alone. Most of my colleagues were experiencing the same problem that year. And whenever you're in a situation like this, where your audience is just all over the place, your overwhelming temptation is to want to just stand there and say, look, if you don't like it, leave, but either give me your full attention or get out. I actually had a colleague who said those very words, and you know what happened? The students got up and left. They stood up, they walked out, and he was left with an almost empty classroom. But I discovered a magic sentence. And when I spoke that magic sentence, suddenly all of the students looked up. They leaned forward. They gave me their full attention. And this lasted for several minutes. And whenever they started to lose it, all I needed to do was speak that magic sentence again, and they were back. I'd never seen anything like it. But I've since discovered that it doesn't just work in that one city. That same magic sentence works exactly as well in Guangzhou, in Beijing, in Geneva, in Colombia, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And right here, right now, notice how you're listening a little more closely to me? What was that magic sentence? It's what I started this with. Let me tell you a story. When I use that sentence, you probably paid more attention. My students do. Whenever I share this experience, my students look up. They get quiet. They lean in. They give me their full attention. I don't know what it is about stories, but we just can't live without them. Studies find that about 35% of our conversation over drinks or dinner or lunch with friends is exchanging stories. Right now, most nonfiction writers rely heavily on the power of story. It's called creative nonfiction, and it's based on the idea that you want to string together story after story after story, mostly in novelistic form, to craft a more engaging narrative. Speakers will tell you that most of what public speaking is amounts to connecting stories together with principles in between. They sometimes refer to this idea as a string of pearls. And think about the great teachers of old, Confucius, Aesop, the sages, Jesus. Much of what they relied on as teachers were great stories. The same is true for famous leaders like Lincoln, Reagan, Lyndon Johnson. Coincidentally, they were powerfully persuasive and also were highly skilled storytellers. It was almost a signature feature of their political careers. Why is storytelling so powerful? For several reasons. First, it engages, almost like a movie, creating a vivid, memorable experience. Also, it cuts tension. It humanizes. It entertains. It's memorable. And it illustrates ideas in a face-saving way that invites the listener and lets the listener draw his own conclusions. In contrast, telling someone facts about this or that or the other thing often prompts them to argue. There's evidence even that the human mind is wired to grasp stories more quickly, easily, deeply, and lastingly than it can grasp abstraction. Studies find, for example, that fundraising appeals draw twice as much money when they emphasize one person than when they emphasize facts and figures about many people. Other studies suggest that stories produce greater learning than factual presentations do. And so now I can let you in on a secret. These are some of the reasons why I start most of our sessions and most of my classes, with a story, and use them throughout my talks. I've used 4 already in this one. Here are a couple of things that can help you when you use stories to do it more persuasively. First, have stories ready to go, especially stories that address likely objections your counterpart may raise. You can actually think, here's a point I want to make. Maybe there's a story that might lend itself to addressing her concern. Do I have any? When you're telling the story, tell it with your whole being. Tell it with your hands. Tell it with your eyes. Tell it expressively. If possible, try to tell it in a clear, simple narrative direction. Don't talk like Citizen Kane. Don't tell it like Citizen Kane or Pulp Fiction with lots of flashbacks and flash forwards. Try to make it as simple to follow as possible with vivid, concrete language, and people will really get engaged with you. Now let me turn to an approach that's so effective that professors, facilitators, salespeople, and attorneys routinely use it. An approach that can be particularly helpful when you lack authority, when you find yourself in a position of weakness, and even when you don't know very much. To demonstrate it, I'm going to ask you to imagine that you are part of a group. I'm also going to ask you for your indulgence because at times I'm going to ask some very dumb questions. So here we go. Who wrote Hamlet? Who wrote Julius Caesar, Macbeth, the Sonnets, A Midsummer Night's Dream? Okay, William Shakespeare, you say. Got it. Now, can you tell me a little bit about him? Where was he born? Okay, you say he was born at Stratford-on-Avon. Okay, and can you tell me what class he was born into? That is, was he highborn or was he a commoner? Okay, he was a commoner? Got it. All right. Now, please jot down on a scale of 1 to 10 how confident you are about that. So, for example, if you're completely confident, give it a 10. Mixed, give it a 5. Not at all confident, a 1. Okay, now, help me please. I'm curious to learn how we know William Shakespeare wrote these works. Can you help me here? Well, you might say, his name is on the works. Of course, fair enough. Just help me out here. If we wanted to make sure that it wasn't just some pen name of some other writer, what assures us that he was the author? Okay, you say it's common knowledge. The history and the literary textbooks say it's, he's the author, and experts confirm it. Got it. Now, to make sure I'm getting this, how do the experts know that he wrote these works? Well, you first might say, they probably have lots of documentation about his life. They've copies of the plays in his handwriting, letters from him about his art, and so on. Got it. Makes sense. But, I'm sorry, I'm a little puzzled because I understand that actually there are 70 verified documents that prove he lived, but that none of them have anything to do with writing plays or poems. In fact, they're not even in his own handwriting. So I'm still a little muddled here. Is there anything else that we can do to help us just nail this down? Well, you might say we could look at what contemporaries said about him. Right, exactly. Of course, we'd have to leave out people who only knew the works themselves, like people who only knew Mark Twain by his books, and find people who clearly knew him personally. And there seems to be nothing like that, with a couple of cryptic debated exceptions. So, is there anything else we could look to? Well, you might say, the plays themselves probably have references to his life and match what we know about him. Got it. The thing is that there's little, if any, reference to Stratford-on-Avon in any of the works, and here's where I'm really flummoxed. The plays seem to have been written by someone who was quite familiar with falconry, a rich man's sport like polo today, who knew law inside out, quoted 200 books when books were very expensive, who traveled among the rich in Italy, and where 12 of the plays are set, who wrote intimately about Elizabethan court life, and whose works trashed the most powerful men in England at a time when playwrights were routinely jailed for offending the government, yet there's no record of him ever having been jailed. So I'm still confused. What am I missing here? Okay, before we go further, please write down now, on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident you are that William Shakespeare, commoner from Stratford-on-Avon, wrote the plays and sonnets. And do one thing more, please. Also write down, on a scale of 1 to 10, how demanding, argumentative, and assertive I was. If you found that I was extremely demanding, argumentative, and assertive, put down a 10. If I was extremely humble and respectful, put a 1. And so on. When I do this exercise with my students, we find that their confidence level collectively goes down about 25 to 50% in 10 minutes. By comparison, it can take months or years for public opinion to change that much on major issues. How assertive was I? Not much, apparently. Most find that my approach was quite humble and respectful. They give it a 2 or a 3. In fact, I never said what, if anything, I believed at all about the Shakespeare authorship question. I could still go the other way. And if we were to go back and review what I said, we'd find that after you first rated my confidence level, I asked 6 questions, repeated your likely answers each time, and only 3 times shared any information at all. What's happened here? I've simply harnessed the persuasive power of question asking and active listening. In our previous sessions, we've seen their power to reduce conflict and foster learning and creativity. Now we're going further and discovering these same skills can be a powerful influencing strategy. By simply asking simple, powerful questions and recapping the answers, I shaped and directed the conversation. I took a humble approach that allowed me to challenge a seemingly certain fact, and I did it without offending listeners, without being aggressive or argumentative, without committing myself to a position, and without losing face. If the answers I got were strong and compelling, I could simply say, "Thank you. That's very helpful. You've given me a lot to think about. Let me consider it, and if I have further questions, maybe we could explore it further later." In short, I've used an approach that's safe and persuasive. And because it leaves face-saving room for me to genuinely learn things and consider them seriously, it has integrity. This humble, inquiring approach is at the heart of several different kinds of leadership and persuasion. One of the leading approaches to salesmanship rejects fast-talking argument and strongly embraces the power of question asking and listening. We've seen it before. Neil Rackham, a social scientist whom we've met earlier, has championed this approach with a method that salespeople have widely adopted. He refers to it as spin selling, as you may recall. In essence, he teaches the salesperson to ask about the customer's situation, her problems, their implications, and finally, the needs they create. As the customer answers these questions, she in effect starts to see for herself that she has specific needs, and she also becomes open to letting the salesperson solve them with his product. Similarly, skilled professors and teachers spend lots of time developing questions. Like salespeople, they know that the one who asks the questions shapes and guides the conversation. If the questions are good, they draw out from the student the lessons the teacher wants them to learn. Better, because the students told the answers to the teacher, the students feel buy-in and ownership of these very lessons. Facilitators also know how to influence others with questions and listening. By crafting simple, powerful questions and reflecting back what they hear, they can guide a group to consensus when most think it's impossible, and win so much buy-in in the process that the group is willing to carry out and fight for the answers that they've reached. And every trial lawyer knows that asking good questions during the trial can truly shape the jury's opinion. What kind of questions, then, can help you persuade others in a negotiation or conflict? One good place to start is to first ask a simple, broad question that gets the other person talking about the situation as she sees it. What do you think? What's going on? What situation are you facing? How do things seem to you on this topic? In our demonstration, I started with, who wrote these plays? That is, who do you think wrote these plays? A useful follow-up question is one that probes deeper. What's the problem? Or, if the other person has given you a strong position, how do you know that this is the answer? Notice the power of using softening phrases that signal deference and humility, like, help me here, and just so I'm getting this. In the demonstration, I asked, help me understand, how do we know? Notice how that simple probing question reveals premises, presumptions, and possible factual or logical gaps. Notice, too, that when you ask questions, the burden of proof always is on the other person. That's possible because you're not taking a strong position, you're just asking to understand hers. Then, simply by saying back the other's answer and legitimately asking for clarification, you can test and quietly challenge her answer and help her see possible problems with it. I did that several times. So you're saying this. Okay, here's where I'm confused. I'm a bit puzzled. And to introduce contrary information in a humble, face-saving way, you can raise it as a question, saying, I'm confused because I've read that X is true. Help me reconcile that with what you're saying. Beyond the methods we've considered so far, it's worth returning lastly to one of the most powerful and important of all, the power of genuine generosity, trustworthiness, and concern for others. As we've seen before in his book Give and Take, Wharton Professor Adam Grant observes that there are three kinds of people: takers, matchers, and givers, and that of the three, certain givers tend to be the most successful. They tend to have a much higher level of goodwill or trustworthiness, of reputation for honesty. The networks they develop also tend to be stronger. All of this tends to eventually redound to their own success. They tend to have more persuasive power than others do. Grant's work suggests that there's a genuine power, a unique power to something that you've known since you were a child and may still very well cherish: power of genuine decency and largeness of spirit. Grant is observing that the reputation for compassion ultimately may be one of the most persuasive things we have. Now, here's a strange paradox. In some ways, we can't be calculative about this. We can't resolve to be nice so that we eventually profit. So we need to avoid turning Grant's insight into slick salesmanship. That's really the opposite of what we're talking about here. The idea is simply that genuine humanity may be the most important and powerful power we have. So, look for ways to genuinely share something of your own doubts, fears, anxieties, and experience in negotiation, not a sign of weakness, but as a way to humanize and connect. That doesn't mean confessing deep traumas, divulging vital secrets, or acting like a wimp. It means being willing to share a bit more personally than you first think is safe, precisely because negotiation, as we've seen, is not leisure. The other side is probably more worried and fearful than you think. Your vulnerability, matched with preparation, can be disarming and can foster a credibility that you might not otherwise enjoy. To sum up what we've seen in this session, use a number of persuasion tools that appeal to the other person's interests, such as "you're right," "if we agree, if we disagree," and "help me serve your interests." Also, use storytelling persuasively. Instead of directly arguing with someone who holds a strong position, try using simple questions and active listening as a persuasive strategy. Practice being more emotionally vulnerable to help you persuade from gut to gut, and cultivate your genuine ability to be truthful, generous, and honest so your reputation for trustworthiness and decency is growing. Here are a couple of suggestions. One thing that you can practice this very day is the phrase, "let me tell you a story." See if introducing a story in the middle of a conversation or disagreement helps you in your efforts to persuade. Another is to practice persuasion by question asking. See what happens if intentionally you avoid direct argument in your next bull session and instead use some simple questions and active listening to shape the discussion. But now let me let you in on a secret. Despite the power of everything we've explored in the course so far, my students often still feel worried. All these negotiating ideas and tools sound great, they say, but when I'm in the room, I'm afraid I'll just look like a deer in the headlights. My emotions will take over, I'll forget everything, and I'll just fall back to old ways. And that's a legitimate concern. If the emotions and psychological traps of negotiation overwhelm us, then we are in trouble. So in our next session, we'll explore ways to turn your fears around, to manage your anxieties, and respond well to the pressure and stress of negotiation.